I will now introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is Tanya Burchard. Tanya is Associate Director of the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion, CASE, and is Professor in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics. Her research interests lie in theories of justice, including the capability approach, measurement of inequality, and applied welfare policy analysis. Tanya has held research grants from a number of institutions and funding bodies like the British Academy, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Nuffield Foundation, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission. With Polyvisit, she has led the program of research on capability, equality, and human rights within the CASE Research Centre. Her work includes social policy in a cold climate, policies and their consequences since the crisis, with Ruth Lupton, and social justice and public policy, seeking fairness in diverse society, and also the education and employment of disabled young people, frustrated ambition for policy press. Today, Tanya Burchard is talking to a paper entitled Child Poverty in and Out of School. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorella. Thank you, everybody. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I think we're all set. So I'd like to, despite that very generous introduction that Lorella kindly gave, I'd like to start with two disclaimers. The first is that I'm not an education specialist, and the second is that I'm not a philosopher. So quite what I'm doing in an philosophy of education seminar, you might well ask. But where I'm coming from is having thought quite a lot about social policy, including, but not only, education, and thinking quite a bit about inequalities. Second disclaimer is that the data and policy debates that I'm mainly going to reference in my talk relate to England, and I appreciate that many of you have interests in many other countries and contexts. I hope that some of the more fundamental aspects of my arguments, such as they are, might have wider application, but I look forward to talking to you about that perhaps in the discussion later. So we've had news very recently, haven't we, just yesterday, about the UK government's plans for catch-up funding for disadvantaged children who suffered as a result of school closures during the pandemic. Closely followed hot on the heels with the resignation of the individual appointed to oversee this programme, who argued that the 1.4 billion announced yesterday was woefully insufficient. He'd argued in his proposals to the government that 15 billion was a more appropriate sum. And indeed, in his statement, he said that the pandemic had affected all pupils, but hit disadvantaged children hardest. And he claimed that a decade's progress to narrow the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers was estimated to have been reversed. Now, I might take issue with that specific claim for reasons that you'll see in a moment, but clearly the overall tenor of his remarks and his position was that it was disadvantaged children who had been particularly hit by the consequences of the pandemic, and that it behoved us to take that seriously and do something about it. So what I'd like to address today is really two questions. The first is, what does this public and policy debate that we've had around the impact of school closures on children from low-income families tell us about how educational inequalities are understood? And secondly, to what extent are current policies well tuned to tackling educational inequalities for children in low-income families? And to give you a preview of the broad outlines of my argument, I'm going to try to show you that I think we usually avoid confronting the impact of child poverty on educational outcomes in normal times, if I can put it that way, that the sticking plasters that we apply within the school system in England basically don't work, and that I want to argue for a paradigm shift to focus policies on child poverty out of school rather than school-based responses to these educational inequalities. So just to remind us, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this type of statistic, but the gaps in educational outcomes between children in low-income families and others long predate the pandemic, and they were not narrowing, so contrary to Sir Kevin Collins' claim. So this shows for the early years part of education. This is children at the end of what's called the foundation stage, and it's the percent who are judged to achieve a good level of development at the end of that stage, with the grey line showing those the majority of children who are not eligible for free school meals, so broadly equivalent to the non-poor, and the blue line showing those who are eligible for free school meals. And I should say that for sort of reasons of speed, I will use poor, low income, disadvantaged and free school meals as synonyms for the purposes of this talk. But again, I appreciate that in fact there are differences between those concepts and indeed the groups that are identified, the children that are identified by those terms. But so we can see here there was a gap in the data series, in the time series, because they changed the form of the assessment. But we can see there was in fact a narrowing of the gaps between disadvantaged children and others between about 2007 and 2011, 2012. And then there was a further narrowing initially when the new assessment was introduced between 2013 and about 2017. But from then onwards, it was in fact widening again. And this is pre-pandemic, so this just goes up to 2019. At the other end of the educational journey, at level 2, which is sort of good GCSEs levels A star to C, the percentage of young people who'd achieved a qualification at that level by age 19, so by beyond compulsory schooling, the gap there had in fact been widening for the last 5 years between those eligible for free school meals and those not. So this idea that children from low-income backgrounds are disadvantaged in education was really nothing new and should not in any way have taken us by surprise. And in fact, if we compare the gaps, the size of the gaps that we see at the end of the early years foundation stage to those that we see at the other end of education, or the other end of compulsory education, you can see that the gaps between those, the proportional gaps between those who are eligible for free school meals and those who aren't, actually grow. So far from offsetting that difference, that disadvantage, our education system, in fact, if anything, seems to enlarge it through the educational journey. So despite the fact that this was in fact widely known in research and in policy circles, nevertheless, when COVID-19 closed the schools, in terms of public debate, we suddenly discovered that children's home circumstances matter to their education. There was lots of concern about whether households had an internet connection, and if so, whether it was of sufficient quality to support home learning, worries about the availability of IT equipment, whether there was enough room in the house for students to be able to study in peace and quiet, particularly for younger children, but actually also for teenagers. It's essential for them to be able to move around and have space to exercise in order to learn, never mind for their physical health and mental well-being. Questions about whether there was an academically confident parent to guide and support navigate through homeschooling, an IT confident parent to provide all of the support that was needed to access often quite complex platforms that schools rapidly set up to try to deliver home education. And of course, more broadly, concerns about the circumstances that children were living in, and whether, for example, you were in a household where somebody perhaps was a key worker with much greater exposure to the virus, possibly actually falling ill, or even in many cases, of course, too many cases, suffering from bereavement, and also the security of the family income and the way in which anxieties about the standard of living and whether their housing and income was secure impacted on children. So a great deal of hand-wringing about the additional impact of school closure on disadvantaged children. But again, all of this is true when schools are open too. So it matters whether you have an internet connection. It matters whether you've got sufficient space for quiet study. It matters whether you've got a parent who's confident and engaged with schooling to guide and support you. And of course, it matters what else is going on in your household and in your family in terms of your well-being and security. All of those things matter all the time for children's education. It's just that it became considerably more visible during the pandemic. And one just sort of illustration of the way that this seemed to not have been appreciated, this fact of the kind of continuity between the disadvantage that children experience normally in education and the experience during the pandemic, was in my children's school. I was astonished when the school reopened that the laptops that had belatedly been distributed to families who didn't have devices for their children to use for homeschooling were recalled as soon as the school reopened as school property. So the idea that suddenly, because the school was open, clearly there was no further need for the children to have access to IT at home. We also, of course, wrung our hands about the unfairness of assessments this year, this pandemic year. And there was complete muddle, I think, about what fairness means in relation to assessments. So this is just one paragraph that I've highlighted for you here from a Department for Education press release in the early days of the pandemic. This was when they were coming up with the idea of the famous, infamous algorithm. This means, so fair system of assessment means ensuring that GCSE A and AS level students are awarded a grade which fairly reflects the work that they've put in. Ofqual will develop a process that will reflect their performance as fairly as possible and ensure that this is consistently applied for all students. And the exam boards will be asking teachers to submit their judgment about what grade the students would have received if the exams had gone ahead. And it seems to me that in that one short paragraph, we've got at least 4 different underlying concepts about what fairness in assessment might mean. First of all, the idea that it should fairly reflect the work that they've put in. That seems to be indicating that what we think a fair assessment is one that reflects the effort that the student has put in. Secondly, that it reflects their performance as fairly as possible. That sounds like it's a measure of attainment, just the knowledge and skills that you have acquired by whatever means. Thirdly, that it's consistently applied for all students. That looks to be pointing towards a kind of concept of procedural justice, of everybody being treated the same. And fourthly, what they would have got if the exams had gone ahead, which sounds as if a fair assessment would be something around adequately reflecting people's potential rather than their actual level of attainment at a moment in time. In a normal year, I think exams may do a reasonable job on procedural justice. So people are, broadly speaking, treated the same at the point from entering the exam hall through to receiving a grade. And possibly, if we set aside concerns about what actually is being assessed in exams, they may do a reasonable job on attainment, judging whether people have achieved a given level of skills and knowledge. But it's interesting to note that neither of those needed to be affected by the pandemic. There was no reason why the procedure shouldn't be applied in the same way to everybody, nor that the attainment, whatever level people had actually got to, couldn't be assessed. And in fact, pretty much any system that could have been devised, except the one that the government actually came up with, would have achieved procedural justice and could have had some hope of assessing attainment. On the third and fourth possible criteria for what constitutes fair attainment, we should note that exams don't even try in normal circumstances to assess effort. I don't think there's anybody who would seriously claim that a GCSE grade is designed to or intends to reflect the effort that a student has put in. And we know that they do a really bad job in normal circumstances of measuring potential, especially for children from low-income families. And there's, of course, no shortage of research evidence on this connection between bad educational experiences and outcomes and child poverty and family background. So given that all of this was clearly known already, why this hand-wringing about the unfairness of assessments in this particular context? Well, it seems to me that the main reason for this coming to the fore and being debated so vigorously was that for once it wasn't only the children from disadvantaged backgrounds who were being mistreated or unfairly treated according to this fourth measure, the measure of potential, but middle class children as well. And that's why it suddenly became top of the public and policy agenda, not because there was actually anything different about the way in which exams fail to give children an opportunity to show what potential, what academic potential they actually have. So to take a step back and think about what is the evidence on the mechanisms that link worse educational outcomes for children from low-income families. I'm going to just mention four, although there is, of course, a very big and rich literature on this. So the first idea is that this link between worse educational outcomes and family income derives directly from there being fewer family resources. That's financial resources, material resources, as we were just talking about, like having a quiet place to study, but also the human capital, as it's sometimes called, of both parents and siblings. Second main mechanism is through higher family stress. And again, we've mentioned that was relevant in the pandemic, but is also relevant in every other year as well. The third mechanism is potentially through peer effects. So who it is that's around you and the level of expectations and type of expectations amongst your peers. And that partly operates through the way in which school choice happens in England and de facto selective schooling, even where it's not officially a selective school. And then finally, in terms of school resources, both because schools in serving more disadvantaged communities are doing much more to meet a much wider set of needs than schools in more privileged areas, and because of the parental inputs which some schools are able to draw on, and the better chances of good teacher recruitment and retention in more privileged schools. So for all of these mechanisms, in normal times, it's the pupil premium that is intended to fix all that. That's the policy response. So the pupil premium is a recognition that schools need additional resources to support children who are from low-income families, proxied by eligibility for free school meals. So schools get this additional payment per year per pupil, and the total programme spending has been at just about £21 billion over the 10 years since it was introduced in 2011. Although before one gets too swept away by that figure, one should note that it replaced other grants, so giving with one hand, taking away with the other, and has been more recently partly offset by changes to the school funding formula, which previously gave greater advantage to schools in disadvantaged areas, and is also in the context of an overall squeeze on school resources per pupil over this period. Nevertheless, the flagship programme, a considerable spend over 10 years. And the stated aim of this programme, as you will probably know, is to improve the attainment of disadvantaged children, and specifically for secondary schools to close what's called the Progress 8 gap, which is the way in which children improve in their attainment by the time they reach their level 2 assessments. Schools have discretion about how to use the fund, so it's allocated by the number of free school meal pupils in the school, but schools can then use that pot in any way they choose. But unfortunately, the evidence we have is that, broadly speaking, it doesn't work. So in some really brilliant research recently published by Sal Riordan and Michael Joplin at Wolverhampton, they've established, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt that the Progress 8 gap is not correlated with most strategies that schools are using for their pupil premium. One of the most popular strategies that schools use is to invest pupil premium in what's known as quality first teaching or continuing professional development. And this is based on their reading of the advice by the Education Endowment Foundation. But schools also use other strategies, and sometimes a mix, including extra staffing, smaller class sizes, pastoral interventions to support well-being, transition arrangements from primary school, cracking down on attendance in different ways, and so on. But unfortunately, there is no association between what strategy a school uses and their ability to close the Progress 8 gap. And indeed, the Progress 8 gap is not closing over time at all. In fact, the most popular strategy, this quality first teaching, is associated in this study with a larger Progress 8 gap. In other words, an intervention that's using pupil premium funding actually results in schools having a wider gap between those eligible for free school meals and those not in their Progress 8 attainment. What seems to be happening is that the investment in better teaching is being lapped up by the pupils who are already advantaged, so boosting their grades at the top, but not in fact reaching the children who are from disadvantaged families, hence resulting in a wider gap. And in this study, which was mixed methods, the interviews with head teachers and teachers showed very clearly the huge commitment that teachers have to this agenda and the enormous efforts that they go to try to implement imaginative, creative strategies in order to help the disadvantaged children in their schools. And they express considerable frustration about the fact that they don't seem to be able to make an impact on this Progress 8 gap, on improving outcomes for disadvantaged children. Schools often try things, find they don't work, return to something that they've done before. In this study, strategies that one school were trying and that they believed were working had been given up for no good by a school elsewhere, and so on. So a great deal of churn in the sorts of strategies that people were using, frustration not be able to shift this indicator. So we might ask, why not? Why, and what else could work? One positive note before I move on would be to say, acknowledge that of course these outcomes and gaps might well have been worse in the absence of pupil premium funding. So we see that this pupil premium funding hasn't succeeded in narrowing the gap. But given that this programme was being implemented at a time when there was an intensification of child poverty, it's not unreasonable to characterise it as a programme that's been swimming against the tide. And it's very plausible, I think, to suggest that outcomes would have got worse. The gap would have got even bigger in the absence of pupil premium. So when I say that child poverty has been intensifying, this is one of the things that I mean, one of the pieces of evidence that I draw on. And what this chart shows is the level of income support, so through either universal credit or so-called legacy benefits for families with children. In the orange line here, this is a couple family with 2 children, compared to the poverty line, with the poverty line set at, as it usually is in official statistics, on 60% of median income, in this case after housing costs. And you can see that the orange line here is diverging from the poverty line. In other words, the level of income that is guaranteed to families who are on benefits, which is families who are eligible for free school meals, the level of income that they've guaranteed is now only 69% of the poverty line. So if you're on benefits as a family, and this is a couple family, it's worse for lone parents, you are guaranteed to be not only poor, but very poor. by the fact of the levels of the erosion of the levels of social security payments to families with children. And that stands in sharp contrast to the blue line, which is the line for single pensioners. So single pensioners on pension credit are guaranteed an income that puts them above the poverty line. Part of that is because we've taken £10 billion per year by the end of the period out of social security for children. So this chart shows the cumulative change in social security and tax credit spending on children since 2010. And you can see that by the end of the period, we've got down to spending £10 billion per year less on children through the social security system. So what should we do about this problem of the failure of pupil premium to address this gap? The evidence, in contrast to pupil premium, the evidence on what the impact is of giving money to families suggests that it does improve educational outcomes for children. So rather than giving the money to schools, what about allocating that same 21 billion over 10 years to families with children? Well, my colleagues Keris Cooper and Kitty Stewart did a review of evidence on the causal effect of changes in household income on cognitive outcomes for children, and found that the evidence, which is in fact mostly evidence from the US, is that an increase in $1,000 US dollars in annual income for a family improves the cognitive outcomes for children in that family from between 5% and 37%, depending on the study and depending on the measure that's used. And moreover, those effects are larger for lower income households. So that same $1,000 makes more of a difference, as you would expect, at the bottom of the income distribution. So whatever it is that the families are doing with that money, we don't know from these studies what it is they do with that money, but whatever it is, whether it's reducing the family stress, whether it's providing the additional resources, it is feeding through into improvements in educational outcomes for those children. And as Kitty and Keris comment in the conclusion to their article, a boost to income, giving the income directly to the families, is going to have positive effects across a number of different outcomes that we care about, not just educational outcomes. And it's hard to think of another policy that's going to influence as many different outcomes positively at the same time. So here's a summary of what I've tried to say, and then I'll offer one slide of conclusion. So I've tried to suggest that the association between child poverty and worse educational experiences and outcomes for children was foregrounded by the pandemic, but was actually very well known beforehand. The gaps in educational outcomes between children in low-income families and the rest indeed were already growing pre-COVID. So whatever the pandemic has done, it's come on the back of an already deteriorating picture. The concept of fairness implicit in existing assessments is muddled, and it doesn't aim to address the impact of poverty, whatever else it may be trying to do. The government's flagship in-school policy to reduce gaps is not working, despite teachers' considerable efforts. And in part, I think that's because it's dwarfed by the deteriorating financial situation of families on benefits who are the free school meals eligible population. At the same time, we know that increasing household incomes of low-income families is effective in improving educational outcomes. So my conclusion is that we need to develop something like a social determinants approach to education in the same way that scholars concerned about health inequalities have done in relation to health. So the idea that reducing health inequalities can't be achieved through healthcare alone, it's not just about what you do in hospitals or in GP surgeries, that idea has become widely accepted over the last few decades, thanks to people like Michael Marmot and so on. And the focus then has shifted from healthcare and healthcare settings to the social determinants of health, to things like housing, to things like early years provision, employment conditions, diet and exercise, and so on. And I think there's an argument that we need a similar shift in relation to educational inequalities. And rather from continuing to berate schools for failing to fix a problem that's in fact generated outside the school gates, principally in the social security system, I think we should shift our focus instead to tackle educational inequalities to the source of the problem, which is poverty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for such an interesting and very stimulating paper. Your presentation touches on many of the issues that were discussed in previous seminars, not least health inequalities and how there could be we could establish a parallel between health inequalities and the social determinants of health and educational inequalities. Before we open to the audience, I would simply like to ask you a question in relation to the priority that you seem to give to tackling the context, and so the social context, over measures that can be taken within the school. Now, I very much appreciate the two disclaimers that you stated at the beginning, but a great deal of educational research on questions of poverty and its effects on educational outcomes question not only the measurement of education success in terms of outcomes and reducing the gap, although without undermining its importance either, but also it questions the possibility of tackling what is called the pedagogy of poverty. So the fact that children who live in disadvantaged areas often are offered very reduced school experiences, given the pressure that schools are under and the many social factors that sort of compound on the pedagogical aspects. So I wonder whether you could have any thought at all about this possibility of prioritizing a context over perhaps a different provision within schools. Some also noted the importance of the locality, of the local intervention, rather than very wide kind of approaches like the pupil premium, which might perhaps, and I put a huge perhaps, address issues of equality in distributive terms from the center within school to schools, but while being unable to address the single contextual fabric of local schools. I don't know whether these two elements were clear, but I want to hear your thoughts or responses, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorella. Yeah, and I think I don't want to be saying that there is no point giving schools that are serving more disadvantaged communities additional resources. So that would be too extreme. And there is clearly, both in the short term and in the long term, likely to be a need for schools that are serving more disadvantaged communities to have those additional resources. But I suppose what I was trying to point to is that the funding to the schools, whether that's for producing alternative types of provision, as I think you were suggesting, or whether it's for addressing directly some of the needs that the pupils bring to the school, is really tackling the symptoms and not the cause. Yeah. And it's a very high cost way to do that, because a lot of it is not well spent on addressing what will be recurring issues for those children because of the poverty that they continue to live in. And I think perhaps because the free school meals measure is just either you get it or you don't, either you're eligible or you're not, it draws our attention away from how intense the problems of poverty and associated difficult living conditions are for the children who are eligible. Actual lived living conditions are not binary. It's not either that you're poor or you're not. It's about how much you've got to live on and what the implications of that are for your family. And so I think what's one of the things that's been missing has been an appreciation of the fact that the population who are eligible for free school meals have become a much more needy population because of the deterioration in social security, because the safety net is no longer a safety net in any meaningful way. Until it seems to me that until we tackle that, until we address that, any amount of extraordinarily creative approaches in schools, and even with an increase in the funding for those schools and perhaps greater license to try alternative forms of education, none of that, it seems to me, is going to work or is going to be sufficiently effective to overcome these increasing disadvantages that children are experiencing, whether schools are open or closed.
Thank you, Tanya. I see a comment, thanks very much. A comment on the chat from Gary. How much can the misguided fascination with the in-school policy responses now being seen through COVID context as catch-up and learning loss agendas promoted by OECD and World Bank, etc., be attributed to an over-dependence on economic understanding of education? For example, concerns with loss of human capital, productivity, and so on.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure you're right about that, and of course the kind of worry is about how costly it's going to be in the long run in terms of economic productivity, for example, to have a generation of children who are even worse educated than they normally are, even less well served by the education system than they normally are. So yes, I think you're right. That's where the drive comes from, either where the interest in this comes from largely, rather than to do with the kind of intrinsic entitlements of children or the intrinsic value of education for those children. But I think the same arguments that I've been making actually apply even if one wishes to take that more narrowly economistic view of education, because it's also just inefficient to spend money on trying to fix the symptoms rather than fixing the causes. And as the quote from the Money Matters review by Keris Cooper and Kitty Stewart that I put up suggested, actually investing in families and diverting the money directly to families is likely to produce benefits not only in terms of narrowing educational gaps, but also across a range of other outcomes as well, which are also economically beneficial, such as improving the health of the population. So I think whichever way you look at it, there just isn't a good argument for keeping the money in schools rather than giving it directly to families. Of course, we know why it hasn't been developed in that way, and that's purely political. It's about beliefs about what families do with money, and whether you want to give money to people who are seen as undeserving, and all of those debates that we probably haven't got time to get onto today.
Thank you, Tanya. And it reminded me somehow also about debates on, do you remember about disability and whether it would have been more appropriate to actually give money to the disabled person themselves and their families for buying support services rather than providing services in different ways through social agencies. So it's a very important point. We've got a very last question that I can take, because we have quite a bit of time to discuss also further papers. So I'm not taking away time from other speakers, just allowing for one more comment. Could it be the case that the safety net has been weakened on purpose, perhaps for the purpose of keep taxations low, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. So there was a commitment by the coalition government after the 2008 financial crisis, when the coalition government came in the UK in 2010, to remove 12 billion from social security as part of austerity. So that was absolutely intentional. But what was less explicit is that because pensions were protected. And again, it's not that difficult to work out why in political terms it was pensioners that were protected. That implied taking it out of working age and children's benefits. So that's where the cuts have fallen. In fact, it's even more extreme than the picture that I showed you, just in terms of social security and tax credits, because at the same time there were also very substantial cuts to local authority budgets and some of the services that local authorities provide to support children, especially early years provision through Sure Start and children's centres and so on, also suffered very, very significant budget cuts, particularly in the first part of this period, so from 2010 through to 2015. So yes, absolutely, it was intentional. I don't think it was intentional in terms of thinking through the consequences for increasing educational gaps, although it was absolutely predictable that would be the consequence.
Thank you, Tanya. Please join me in thanking Tanya again for this brilliant presentation and discussion. Thank you. No doubt a lot of further thoughts about intergenerational justice, but let's leave it like at that. And thank you again, Tanya. Let's move now to our second speaker today. And we will go a little bit over with time. So starting now, we will be going until 3:30 and have a shorter break. This is what usually happens with us because we don't want to curtail brilliant discussions and presentations. So please bear with us. Our second speaker today is Professor Jonathan Wolff. Joe is the Alfred Landecker Professor of Value and Public Policy and the governing body fellow at Waltham College, Oxford. Joe is a political philosopher who works on issues of equality, disadvantage, social justice and poverty, as well as applied topics such as public safety, disability, gambling, and the regulation of recreational drugs, which he has discussed in his book, in his books, Ethics and Public Policy, A Philosophical Inquiry, and The Human Right to Health. His other works include An Introduction to Moral Philosophy, Disadvantage with Avner Deschalit, An Introduction to Political Philosophy, and Why Read Marx Today, an absolute classic on Marx, and Robert Nozick. Joe is currently developing a new research program on revitalizing democracy and civil society. Now, today, Joe will talk to us on their spoiled and lazy miss, education as escape. Joe.
Thank you very much, Lorella, and thanks also to Elaine and Judith for inviting me. So the main point of comparison with my talk and Tanya's is it begins with qualifications and exceptions and saying why I'm not really qualified to be talking about this topic. So like Tanya, I haven't worked on education in any systematic way. I've written a little bit about higher education for The Guardian, but I haven't studied education. And although I've worked a little bit on child poverty, not systematically, I think I've just written one paper that was trying to reply to the reactionary view that none of you have, that child poverty is the fault of the parents. And so, you know, for you in this call, that would be an easy target. So I'm by no means a specialist about this. I've warned, I think it was Lorella who invited me, it might have been Judith, I think one of the two of you invited me, and I think I replied saying I've got nothing to say on this topic. And the response to that was, well, say it anyway, you've got nothing to say. But what this means is that it's given me an opportunity to talk about something that's been on my mind for quite a long time and that I haven't spoken about before. And so it's a slightly self-indulgent talk, so I hope I'm in a friendly audience here for this talk. So what it goes back to, about, it must have been almost 10 years ago. When I was still at UCL before I went to Oxford, I got a little bit involved with the Philosophy for Children movement. And one of the teachers, Miriam Cohen, who had been a student of mine many years before, was working in schools in East London, and they'd had their budget cut and they couldn't continue with the program. And I had some unspent research money. So I thought, well, let's try and combine the two things. Let's see if we can do some sort of political philosophy research and also do the philosophy for children, because it didn't require much money and I had the budget for it. So Miriam did her normal program, but we changed some of the sessions so that we could talk to the students a little bit about social justice as well. So I think it would have been a session around every week over the course of the term. They should warm them up, should got their confidence that they were doing very well. And then I came along for one of the sessions. I just sat in, I didn't really participate because she had her techniques to talk about social justice with the students. So they did their normal sort of exercises for the first half, and then we moved it over. So this was a school in East London. It was a secondary school. They were, I never remember which year is which anymore, but they were in the first or second of the years of secondary school. It was mixed. It was socially, I would say, a disadvantaged school. The children were not, I don't think, in extreme poverty, but the group that we worked with, they were all students who had, because they were taken out of their normal classes for this, there were students who were thought they wouldn't suffer if they were taken out of their classes. So in other words, they were the highest achieving students who were sort of coasting through their other classes. This was a type of stretch activity for them. So they were the brightest kids in their year. So who were they? Well, they were almost all female. I think there was one male student out of the 20 or 30 that we had, and they were all from immigrant families. Okay, so the high achieving kids in this school were all female immigrant families. Some of them who hadn't even been able to speak English 2 years before were now chatting away, very, very fluently and very easily. So we had we began by just getting them talking about their ideas of social justice. And they were more sophisticated and they'd read more or they'd talked more than I thought. So how old would they be? 12, 13. And the overwhelming view in the room was a form of sort of primitive communism in the room, that they all thought that everyone should have the same, or things should be shared out, and there was no good reason for anyone else to get a bit more than another. And then as we talked a bit more, they seemed to be forming the view that some jobs were harder than other jobs, some jobs were harder work than others, and they told us that the cleaners, the people in the school, the cleaners were the hardest workers in the school. And we went off to other things, came back, had a bit of discussion, and said who should get paid more? What are the principles that you would use for paying people more? And they came up with a principle that those who worked hardest ought to get more. So we went off, talked about other things, and we came back and we said, actually, look, you've said two things. You said the cleaners work hardest, and those who work hardest should get more. So are you saying that the cleaners should be the highest paid workers in the school? And of course, they got very nervous at this, and they didn't really want to accept that consequence. So then they started talking about, well, the headmistress, if she makes a mistake, that's really serious. If a cleaner makes a mistake, that's not so bad. So they started having a more sophisticated view that turned out to be a much more conventional view of social justice. So that was a great discussion. I can imagine it being not dissimilar to sorts of discussions I might have had with beginning students a few years older. And so we talked quite generally about social justice, and then we'd prepared this. The person I was working with at some point said, there is one group in society, one group of people in schools who are not doing so well as anyone else. So they're not getting good results, they're not getting places in university relative to their size in the population. And these are white boys. White boys are not doing so well. And this was a very well-behaved group. So normally they'd put up their hand before they talk. There was a ball that was passed around. But before they did that, one Ukrainian girl just sat up straight and said, "Well, they're spoiled and they're lazy, miss." And this is what I've been thinking about for the 10 years since, okay? So the instinct of the immigrant girl in a poor area, I don't know if anyone was in poverty, but definitely poorer. When we talked about their jobs, quite a few of them, their parents were unemployed or in very low skilled jobs. So their instinct was that these white boys that the newspapers are full of, in terms of they're the forgotten generation, they're left behind, discriminated against. As far as this girl was concerned, they're a privileged group. They're spoilt and lazy. And they're doing badly in school because they're spoilt and lazy. Okay, they're not spoiled and lazy because they're doing badly. It's the other way around. They're not trying. They're not trying because they don't have to. And this, as I said, this left quite an impression on me. And we didn't challenge her on it. I mean, maybe we should have done. Maybe we should have asked for a bit more, because I wasn't expecting that response. And I was a bit stunned by it. But what happened as we went on, it turned out that almost all of these girls in the class were studying also in their spare time. They were studying in the weekend. They were doing classes at the weekend or in the evening. They were really dedicated. They really wanted to do well. It wasn't particularly, I think, they wanted to learn, especially, although they had lively minds. They wanted to do well. And when we talked about it, so one of the girls who had been talking about cleaners being so hardworking and it was the worst job. When we were talking about her in detail, this was a girl from Central America. She said that both her parents were cleaners, and her ambition was to get her family out of cleaning. And that she said it was really down to her and one of her cousins could do this. So she and one of her cousins had the potential to do well at school. And if they did do well at school and they got a good job, then they could, either her or her cousin could do it. Her brothers and sisters and her other cousins they wouldn't have been able to do it. So she felt that she had the burden of her talent, that she had to make the most of it in order to bring her family into a better standard of living. And you can see as she said that, other girls were saying the same thing. And although they didn't say, there were a number of Bangladeshi girls in this room, and it was clear they were living in multi-generational households where if you didn't do well at school, you would be probably doing domestic work, maybe for the rest of your life. So this is my title, They're Spoiled and Lazy, Miss. You've seen the first half of that. The second half, Education as Escape. And it felt to me that these girls, or some of them, saw education really as a lifeline for them, as a way in which they would be able to achieve a better life. Definitely for them, but in many cases, it was a family responsibility, not just for them. But they were very, very naive. So one of the students from Nigeria, I think she was, a very bright girl. So we were talking about what they wanted to do, and she said, "Well, I haven't made up my mind. Either I want to be a brain surgeon or a dental nurse." And you think, well, that is a strange thing. It's not that if I'm bright enough, I'll be a brain surgeon. If not, I'll be a dental nurse. It's I'll be either a brain. I haven't made up my mind yet. As if there's not much difference between being a brain surgeon or a dental nurse. I mean, they both wear white coats or something. So you have these people who are in some ways sophisticated in their thought, but also just lack the type of cultural understanding. And we did another, we did a follow-up study of them because I was very interested to see what their lives were like outside school. And this is where we found out that many of them were spending their weekends, at least part of the weekends. So I mean, it was fascinating. Many of them had lived in several different countries because they were refugee families or immigrant families. But once they got to the UK, they barely moved a mile away from where they were living. You can date this because that game you do on your phone, Pokemon Go, I think, where you had to collect Pokemon from different. Someone had gone up to London, central London, for the first time in order to collect some sort of Pokemon on Tower Bridge. So this is what got them. I thought this was fantastic. Who knew that these things would have that effect? And they were giving their tips for how, they said the buses were slow enough in central London, you can kid the thing into thinking you're walking so you can get more points, sort of thing. So they were swapping their tips about it. But they had this very narrow life. They were just shopping locally, meeting locally, not really even wanting to leave the area, and having these rather narrow perspectives. So this is fascinating in its own right. And I was wondering how well these things fit with other things I've been thinking about around poverty and disadvantage. So clearly these children are at some form of structural disadvantage. They don't have the forms of support at home that Tania has talked about, although they have some of them, and I'll get back to that. So it's not that they have bare home settings, but they probably don't have their own room, they probably don't have a good internet connection, but someone is paying for them to go to school on Saturday, probably. So they are getting that support. They are at some form of structural disadvantage. Now, in the work I've done on poverty, a lot of it was motivated, or partly was motivated by Tania asking me to do work on poverty, I think, or other people at the Rowntree Foundation asking me to do it. But the sorts of things I've always been very interested in is a type of reactionary challenge. I mentioned it about the idea that parents are responsible for their children's poverty. There's something that comes up everywhere. It's in Rowntree, it's in, he challenges it in contemporary debates, which goes, the current version of it is, if they've got a smartphone, how can they be poor? Or when I was, first moved into central London, it would be, if they've got a satellite dish, how can they be poor? In Joseph Rowntree, it's, if they can go to the cinema, how can they be poor, right? And this is something that had worried me, I suppose, because it does make you think, well, if they can do that, then surely they can spend that money on other things. So there are two things that have changed my view or form my view. One isn't relevant, the other is. The one that's not relevant is the idea that the occasional luxury is a necessity. And so you can't just say that thing is a luxury, therefore you shouldn't have it, that everyone needs some luxuries in their life in order to feel like a human being. So there are all sorts of things we do just to feel like a human being, to forget about our situation from time to time, which is part of what it is to be poor. But the point that's more relevant here is not so much you're poor not because of what you choose, but because of the cost to you of having made that choice. So for someone, so Rowntree talks about people who go to the cinema and people saying, now how can they be poor if they go to the cinema? And Rowntree says, well, working people are human like us, they have human needs like us, they can't exist on a fodder basis, a very interesting animal metaphor that very often comes in thinking about poverty. They can't exist just on a fodder basis, but what they pay for going to the cinema is much more than others would pay. So he doesn't mean that in terms of money, but if you go to the cinema, maybe you're walking to work rather than getting the bus for the next week, or you're going without lunch. That is, so the cost of your choice is what you have to give up in order to make that choice. And this is really Sen's insight in talking about capability as sets of functionings. And this is something actually that is lost in Nussbaum's version of the capability approach. But Sen talks about your capabilities as the vector of sets of functionings, which is an over elaborate way of putting it, I think. But the thought is just, if you do choose that, what do you have to give up in order to do it? So the difference between me and a poor person and our consumption of a mobile phone, of a smartphone, is that I can buy a smartphone and it makes a difference to how much money I've got in the bank, but it's very unlikely to make much difference to anything else in my life. Whereas a poor person who buys a smartphone may find that they can't buy clothes when they run out, or can't repair an appliance, or can't visit friends and family and so on, but has to make real choices in their life to do it. So it's really a matter of what is the opportunity cost. So the richer you are, the less the opportunity cost of your choices. The poorer you are, the greater the opportunity cost of your choices. So that's why I think of poverty as being about the cost of your choices rather than what you actually choose. Okay. So these girls are making a choice to give up a social life to educate themselves more, right? So it's quite a high cost for them to get the same level of education that a wealthier person may be able to get just because of the quality of the school they go to and the support maybe they have for home. So yes, they are able to work hard. If you go back to Tanya's, the level of effort these girls are putting in, they should be getting A stars just for effort on that. But they probably won't because, okay, the schools are good, but they're probably held back by other kids in the class. They're not doing so well, don't get that individualized support that they might elsewhere. But another idea, and I know I haven't taken up very much time, very interested in the discussion of this. So I think this may be almost what I'm going to end with. I've got one more thing to come back to. In work I've done with Avner de Chalit, work on disadvantage, in one paper, we toyed with the idea of what we called severe disadvantage. So we relate disadvantage to the notion of risk. And one thing that happens for poor people is that very often that making a choice exposes them to other risks. So if you decide to take a job that involves evening work, for example, and you can't afford a car, then you may put yourself to the risk of traveling public transport late at night. May not be a very high risk, but it may be something that makes you uncomfortable. So you do things that expose you to other types of risk. Well, we extend this somewhat in thinking about severe disadvantage. So the idea of severe disadvantage for us is that you're in a position where you may have some opportunities to improve your situation. So it's not impossible for you to improve your situation. But if you go down that path, you run a risk of making yourself even worse off than where you were to begin with. Right? So you're running a thin line. It's like the tightrope. You're walking a tightrope. If you successfully get to the other end, you've achieved something. If you don't, you fall off and you're worse than you were before. Right? So for me, when we talk about someone being comfortable, someone coming from a comfortable family, it seems to me it's a family where you can pursue opportunities at very low risk, like feather bedded. So if you fall off, you're going to land on your feet, right? That there's enough support around you so you can take these opportunities, you can take a risk. And so this idea, capitalist rewards risk takers. Well, yes and no, right? It rewards risk takers who can afford to take that risk. It doesn't reward people who take a risk and fail very badly and don't have a safety net. So it would be an exaggeration to say that for these girls that they're in a position where there's a severe disadvantage, but they are going down a path where they're giving up a huge amount, and it's very unclear where it's going to lead them. That they may be doing these evening classes, they may be doing Saturday classes, they may be putting everything in at school, but it may well be that they still get mediocre GCSEs. Maybe there's a problem in their family, so they have to leave school early. There's no guarantee that going along this path that has cost them a lot will actually pay off in any way. And maybe we could think of cases where it makes them worse off. I don't want to press that, but it's just that these are not costless things that they're doing. Okay. Now, where they do have an advantage, so you remember I said it was immigrant. All these kids were from immigrant families. Of course, there were a lot of immigrant kids in the school, but by no means all. I mean, there were many white British kids in the school as well, but none of them were in the high achieving class. So why was that? Was it because they're all spoiled or late, spoiled and lazy? Or is it other reasons? And it did seem to me that one thing these kids had in common was they came from families that valued education and gave them a lot of support. So they had their own motivation to do things. The families didn't think it was a stupid thing for girls to get education. The families were behind them. And so they had that emotional support. And in some cases, they probably came from quite educated families to begin with, of course, because there's that class element. Very often refugee families are from a higher social class than the one they fall into in the receiving country. So they had the intelligence to support a family and the motivation that made the difference. And the spoiled and lazy British boys. So, okay, final thought. So go back to these British boys. Now, what is their life going to be like? Well, if they don't get qualifications at school, either they're going to get a job in the Romford market or something, or they're going to work with their dads in the construction industry or laying carpets, or they're just going to be able to hang out with their friends. I mean, no one is going to ask these kids to look after the boys. No one is going to ask the boys to look after their grandmothers. But they might ask the girls, although less likely to ask the white girls, it seems, than to ask the Bangladeshi girls. So this is conjecture. I don't have statistics for this. And as you can tell, all of this is conjecture. This is the opposite of science. It is reflections on a case of n=1. But as you can tell, that single comment got into my bones, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk about it for a little while. And on that note, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for, again, an extremely interesting and rich presentation, which opened up a lot of tacit as well as explicit avenues for reflection. But I just wanted to say one thing. It's amazing how all these people, how our speakers who have all these disclaimers about how not well prepared they are for contributing to this seminar end up giving us so many rich thoughts to think about. So I just wanted, for me, I mean, there are numerous thoughts that link to previous themes, but for me the most probably the most pressing is this question: is education, so it would have been interesting to follow the trajectories of those girls and to know where they ended up really, because the crucial one of the questions that we asked and we are trying to consider is education really an escape? Is it really a way out of poverty? And if it is, for those who are, you know, at significant disadvantage, what are the associated costs? And how are these costs actually considered or at all considered when we look at the situation of students in disadvantage and in poverty? And this seems to me to relate very closely also to Tanya's point about the social determinants of disadvantage in education and so on. So I wanted just to throw that in the open, together with questions of course, gender equality, and many other considerations that are incredibly relevant to all the themes we've been discussing. So
yeah, so thank you for that. It's really important and does link with something else that I'm slightly obsessed with, which is Annette Laroe's book Equal Starts. So I don't know how well known this is, but it's a study, probably Philadelphia, somewhere in the Northeast. And part of it, she does this micro study of only about 16 kids, maybe more than that, maybe 30, but small numbers. And she segmented them, so half white, half black, half male, half female. And then there are 3 social groups. So there's a sort of upper middle class, working, not working poor, but lower income working, and then the poor. And they had observers with each of the boys and girls, so each family. So her research assistants just lived, I think, with these families for a month and observed them. And it's fascinating that in advance, there was a conjecture that there would be a big gender difference, big racial difference, and a difference between each of these three groups. In the end, they only found one difference, one significant difference, and that was between the upper middle class kids and everyone else, right? And the difference was that the upper middle class kids lived very much in their nuclear family with their parents. They didn't see their cousins, they didn't see their aunts, they didn't see their grandparents. They spent most of their time in their own age group. So in their leisure activities, they would go off to Little League or ballet or music or choir, always in their same age group. And they lived according to the diary, so everything was organized for them. And they interacted with adults quite a lot, but in this diarized way, right? Whereas the other kids had very much more informal play. They didn't live by the clock. It didn't matter if they didn't turn up in the park for a game of whatever it was because someone else would play. Whereas if you didn't turn up for your football game on the organized team, that was a disaster. So the middle class kids were learning about teamwork and diary and calendar. And it sounds like they have an utterly miserable time, except they're being perfectly prepared for university and the workplace. But everything depends on not letting other people down and living to the clock. Whereas the other kids don't do that at all. They barely relate to adults other than to be told off about things or to be called in for dinner. So if they have a dispute, they deal with it themselves. They become much more emotionally intelligent as a result of this, much more empathetic, but they don't have the skills for college and the workplace. So they don't really understand why it matters so much if they don't turn up for class, whereas the other kids have been drilled into it. Okay. So I lent this book to a friend of mine who was a teacher, and she lost it, didn't give it back. So when I was working on it again, I had to buy a second copy. I had to buy the second edition of it. And this second edition is utterly heartbreaking for two reasons. So one is that in the first edition, she more or less makes a prediction that all the upper middle class kids will have successful lives and all the others won't. And there was only one of the middle class kids who didn't go to university, and she had a learning disorder that was already noted beforehand. So all the predictions came true. But also, the really heartbreaking thing is she went back to see these families. She'd promised them all a book, and they all hated the way they'd been depicted. They all thought they'd been completely unfairly treated, because middle class families were depicted as having this joyless life of living by the clock. And all the other families had this sort of chaotic life of people, in some cases, kids not even having their own bed, just whoever goes to bed, sleep first, goes and lies down on the mattress for now. And and people coming in, a cousin, a grown-up cousin who's not meant to come in, sneaking in through the window and sleeping overnight and leave. So you have these sort of completely chaotic lifestyles. So anyway, it's a fantastic book. I've told you all the good bits, but there, it is in this particular case, birth is destiny, pretty much, for these kids, and that there is no tracking of talent or intelligence with educational attainment. It's all about who your parents are and what they do for you. And so, I'll just say one last thing. So I'm going on too long. So there are two kids who had problems at school. Middle class kids, the parents were in the school, in the teacher's face, calling up the headmaster, dealing with it, right? The working class family said, well, I'm sure the school has our best interests at heart. We'll leave it to them, right? And just drifted off. And so you can see that working class kid had all these loving aunts around. And that's fantastic, but it's no good when you're in dispute with the school. Whereas the middle class kids had no family around, but the parents absolutely were going to go and fight for them and knew how to when it was needed. So you absolutely see it's a micro study. It's not statistically significant, but it was I think just confirms that point that education could be an escape, but in practice, I mean, I went to a primary school in Kent, working class primary school. We were a middle class family that moved around and ended up in an area where there were very few middle class families in the school. In class, there was no relation between intelligence and class. But when I went back onto Friends Reunited 20 years ago, when you did that sort of thing, all the middle class kids had gone to university and moved on. And the working class girl who had gone to the grammar school, was a PA in a local office rather than having gone on. So you just see this over and over again.
Joe, thank you. I have one comment, two questions. So I just read out the comment to you. It's from Ursula saying, young people living in poverty appear to have no social agency as they have few support networks or any educational career mentoring, or indeed the capabilities to break out of poverty. As you say, the risk is too high, exclamation mark. So I don't know whether you would like to comment on that comment, and then bear in mind that we've got two questions. And no, but we've got time.
I just say one thing very quickly. So I think it goes too far to say they have no social agency. I would say it's a very limited amount. And I think these particular girls were very lucky because they had a teacher who was interested in getting an extension for them in school. Had it not been for this, they would have probably had less agency. So I think I absolutely agree. The amount of social agency you have very strongly depends on the amount of support you have. And so, the feminist theories around relational autonomy are absolutely right. The old point from Charles Taylor, you don't make people free by leaving them alone. You make people free by giving them things that will help them exercise their agency. And we absolutely see that here. So thank you.
Okay, Joe, I have a question from Judith. Then I see a question on the chat, and then I have a hand up from William. So William, be ready. I'll ask you to unmute yourself when we've got through the other two questions, if that's okay with you. So Judith first, and then Ursula.
Thank you, Joe. So I kind of wanted to ask this question to Tanya as well, but I think
audio, Judith, we can't hear you properly, please.
Sorry, I do have my sound off. Can you hear me?
Try again?
Yeah. So it's a question about meritocracy, which is something we spoke about in our last seminar, I think. And I agree with Tanya with what you said about needing to look at the sort of root problems. And I think part of what Joe, you said is kind of hints at this as well, that there's this background context that no one's really talking about. And the background context for me is one in which there is still this general consensus that we live in a competitive society with a competitive labour market and a capitalist economy and some kind of meritocracy, even if it's a meritocracy in name only. And another way of looking at this, I suppose, is that those girls who you're talking about, in a way they've bought into that, right? They genuinely believe, for whatever reason, that if they make an effort and do well at school, they have a chance of competing fairly in this meritocracy. Now, it seems to me that that's a myth to a certain extent, and unless we change the background structure of the scarcity of jobs, the competitive nature of the economy, the fact that there are all sorts of other factors that mean that actually it's not really a pure meritocracy, then they're being sold a lie. And just to give you another anecdote, so my son is currently a teacher in a comprehensive school in East London, and he's struggling with kids who are actually really bright, come from not very well-off families, no one in their family's been to university. He teaches maths, and he's struggling to persuade the kids who are really bright and actually do have a chance of doing well at school and going to university that it's worth their while to do so, because they're telling him, well, you know, there are no jobs anyway. And look, I just read this thing online about this guy who became a millionaire by investing in Bitcoin. Why don't I just do that instead of going to university? So I'd just like you to speak a bit to that kind of background context. It's not really a question. It's just, how would you respond to that?
Shall I answer, Lorella, or do you want to get the question? Yep. Sorry, I can't hear you now.
Sorry. Yes, please try and answer, and then we go to the other two questions, and then I will have to cut the discussion abruptly if we go over time terribly. So please don't make me do that. Anyone.
So I'll try to be very quick.
No, not you, everyone.
So on the opportunity, I mean, there's a beautiful distinction that I first came across with Janet Radcliffe Richards, but Tony Atkinson makes it better, which is two different conceptions of opportunity. So one is like a swimming race. The other is like a swimming certificate that many of us got, that the non-competitive form of opportunity. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would try to turn us from a swimming race society to a swimming certificate society, where people can have these rich lives, but not at the expense of other people. In terms of the Bitcoin thing, I think your son ought to teach them about what is it called, survivor bias, and that he ought to tell them about all the people who put all their money into Bitcoin and lost it all, rather than the one person who did it, and get them to tell their stories. It definitely, there is a point that social mobility is not what people once thought it was or should be. I mean, I think role models are so important, and so seeing people like you who've done well and providing a type of life that you aspire to, I think would be the way, if there are such people. Getting people back into the school, kids who've gone to university and have done well, and getting them to come back and talk would be the way to do it. They will never listen to an adult, but they might listen to someone more of their age.
Thank you, Jonathan. A question from Ursula. Politically speaking, what does Jonathan think should happen now, post-pandemic, as we appear to be living in a temporary window of social support?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because all our assumptions about borrowing and money and how an economy works seem to have been false. And that, so I used to pretend that I knew how the economy works. I don't even pretend anymore, because I haven't got a clue. I really haven't got a clue. We're at this point where some people are saying we can build back better. We have got the support. We know how to have almost unconditional basic income now. And there are others, and I'm afraid I'm in this camp, which says it's going to be like it was before, but only worse. That all of the fractures that have broken open, they're not going to be healed. I hope I'm wrong about that. That's a prediction, not a recommendation. But it feels like we've learned how to keep things going, and keeping people alive and well, and getting laptops to kids who need them. So we've been able to do all of these good things. So then the question is, why should they only be temporary? And the pandemic has brought the sort of teenage crude Marxist out of me, and thinking that the economy runs on all these conspiracies to keep people down, and under other conditions you can do it differently, which is when you're in your 60s, a strange revelation to have. But I find things so hard to explain now. I mean, certainly things didn't go the way I did. I thought we would be in incredible economic crisis at this point, and that there would be extreme poverty, and people wouldn't be able to live their lives. But look at us. That doesn't seem to be what's happening.
Thank you, Joe, and we hope that it will continue not to be happening. Thank you. William Hopwood, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Thanks very much. This talk has been incredible. Since disclaimers are all the rage, my knowledge of this is coming from my mother, who works in a very disadvantaged background. So it's secondary from her, and 3 years of philosophy at a degree. But basically, I think Jonathan's talks has been fascinating because it draws out some very interesting philosophical theories of how we conceptualize a child and children in terms of capacities that are relevant that these children have towards education is their imaginative capacity and their typical capacity. So when we're talking about them as decision-making agents about where they want to go in life, about who they relate to, they need to have a conceptual framework that includes university as an option and a reciprocal framework in order to communicate with external agents to meet that goal. And I think what's really interesting is that poverty naturally restricts these capacities that they have as decision-making agents, so that when we talk about, do we give the money to the schools or to the families or to the children, it conflicts it in such a way that we don't want to give it to the children or the parents because their imaginative frameworks are restricted so that they don't even think of university. Poverty can restrict imaginative frameworks so much that if you say give them £50 and say go to the seaside in school, the children don't even know what the coast or the seaside is, because like Jonathan says, in poverty you're restricted to your locality. And so I think if you want to talk about giving money to children, you first need to address philosophical capacities of obviously rationality and decision making, because of their upbringing and their parentage and who they're born, children become non-rational decision agents, and so do parents. And I think it's really interesting to draw out how you conceptualize capacities of children. That's very quick. I'm sorry, I recognize time.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you. So what this obviously puts me in mind of, I'm sure this was deliberate, Lorella's comments in relation to Tanya about the self-directed services in disability. Now, and I did do some work on this. I worked with Simon Duffy, who was really the pioneer, well, one of the pioneers of it. And although as these things go, he got so disgusted with the way it was implemented, he withdrew from it. So one of those things, terrible thing for a policy maker. You come up with a policy, you see it getting implemented, and so changed, distorted. You don't want your name on it anymore. But in the pilots that he did in the north of England, he was working with older teenagers, younger adults who were on the autistic spectrum and had been in daycare. And for people who are not involved in daycare sounds great. But for a lot of people, it's mostly about sitting in a minibus half the day that goes around town picking up other people. So a lot of daycare is very poor and people don't have agency. And so they decided as an experiment, say, well, the money we're spending on daycare, we'll give it to you and you can buy daycare. If you want daycare, you can buy it. But if you don't want daycare, maybe you can buy other things. Now, of course, then you have the problem, well, if you have a limited frame of reference, what are you going to spend money on? So it was really important that people had supported decision making. Yeah. So they had their families around them, and they had social workers, and they had examples of what other people had done. So some people, you can tell how long ago it was. Some people set up mini recycling businesses. So they would go around the neighborhood getting things that they could then take to the scrapyard to recycle and so on. So they do these tiny, tiny enterprises, and they'd spend much more time in the neighborhood. And in fact, one of the surprising things is they got much more free care from others once they're in the neighborhood. So there would be an old lady who would have them around for lunch once a week, something that they wouldn't have had if they were going to daycare. So this whole new way of interacting in the community opened up. So I think if we are going to do this, it goes back to this idea of being supported, having people who can support your decision, who can help you make reasonable risks, but protect you from reckless risks. So this is really what it is about, making sure that in that case, their budget renewed every month. So if they made a stupid decision one month, they could do something, they could recover the next month. Whereas if you're making decisions about going to university or not going to university, those things are not things you can recover from so quickly. So they need more thought. So I just agree with you. One of the questions that we put in our little questionnaire was whether people had been to the seaside. And it was very interesting that people have been to the seaside, but not in the UK. That is because most people around the world are living on the coast somehow. And people had seen the sea, no big deal, but didn't particularly need to see it now. So what have we got in the chat?
Yeah, there's a very interesting comment, which I will just read with my Italian accent for everybody. You don't need me to read it, but I will. But I will not be able to allow comments. We might take it up in our plenary, if that's okay with everybody. So Rowena says, in relation to William's question and Jonathan's attempt to challenge traditional ways that poverty is defined, could it be that at least in some cases, it is the imagination of middle-class policymakers is what is limited in terms of determining what a good quality life is by limiting its metrics to indicators based on the lives that they have enjoyed. For example, a university education.
So can I say one thing, right?
Yes.
So I think this whole thing has been ruined by too many people reading Maslow and thinking there's a hierarchy of needs, right? So I don't think there is a hierarchy of needs in that way. I think needs for luxuries, needs for social life, needs for interaction, needs to get your hair cut, these are needs almost as basic as the need for food and air. I mean, obviously some you'll die and some you won't, but anyway, that's I think we have this sort of intellectualist view of what basic needs are. One of the most brilliant things in the Breadline Britain survey is when people are given a list of essentials, one of the things that comes almost at the top of the list is being able to visit friends and family in hospital. Now, who among the middle classes would have even put that on the list in the first place as an essential need, because we just take it for granted, right? Whereas if you can't do it, it's something that really troubles you. But who would say that was an essential need if you were doing it on the basis of a philosophical theory of essential needs?
Not to speak of the extrinsic benefits of education, for example, in improving your health, your life chances in general, and so on and so forth. So we'll stop here reluctantly, but for time constraints, thank you. Please join me in thanking Joe for this brilliant paper and presentation and discussion. And I would say it's 20 to 4. Can we come back about 10 to 4? And we'll then have our third presentation and then move into the plenary where we can revisit some of these very interesting questions and topics. Is that okay? Thank you very much. I shall see you in 10 minutes. And again, thank you for joining us. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, I think we shall start the second part of our seminar, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Anne Phoenix. Anne is Professor of Psychosocial Studies at the Social Research Institute at UCL Institute of Education. Her research interests include motherhood, social identities, parenting practices, young people, racialization and gender. And she has recently worked on funded projects on boys and masculinities, young people and consumption, and adult reconceptualizations of non-normative childhoods, particularly in the context of serial migrations, visibly ethically mixed households, and language brokering in transnational families. Her publications include Environment in the Lives of Children and Families, Perspectives from India and the UK with Janet Boddy, Black, White or Mixed Race, Race and Racism in the Lives of Young People of Mixed Parentage, and Motherhood, Meanings, Practices and Ideologies with Anne Woolett and Eva Lloyd. Anne will talk today to child poverty, education, and positioning in narratives of childhood identities. Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lorella, and thank you for the invitation. And I want also, I suppose, to lay out some caveats in that I also am not a philosopher. even though I do various things in education. So, but it seems that that is fine, and we'll see what comes out. I have very much enjoyed the previous talks and discussions, and I think that what I'm going to say, which is really just bringing together some ideas rather than talking about a particular project or anything, will fit with what you've already discussed. So, child poverty, education, and positioning in narratives of identity. And I think it's really important to take note of the fact that where we are at the moment is very different from where we were 2 years ago. And it's not just COVID-19, but it is to do with transformational conjunctions of various things that were totally unexpected. So George Floyd's murder and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, as well as COVID-19, Sarah Everard's killing, and what it brought up for many women, and then the way in which it brought intersectional issues, because various people pointed out that there wasn't the same response when Nicole Smallman and her sister Biba Henry were murdered in a park not that long before. And so, you know, what was that about? But nonetheless, the Sarah Everard situation really shifted thinking about society and what was acceptable and so on. So all of those things, I think, have helped to produce various issues, to illuminate them, that are important. One is to do with what I've called intersectional hauntology, and hauntology coming from Jacques Derrida, but developed by other people, the way in which the past haunts the present, so that we have to think socio-historically about where we are, for example, with children and poverty. And I think that we saw really well the way in which Tanya, for example, talked about where we are with childhood and poverty. It has a history that has been built on in this context. And it's intersectional because although we're talking about poverty and so socioeconomic status and so on, we cannot divorce that from racialization, from gender, as well as from nation and from place and other things too. So positioning matters. Children who are in poverty are not all the same. And indeed, Jonathan talked about racialization and gender, those intersections in his talk. Then I think that the importance of recognition, redistribution and representation. So those things that Nancy Fraser, she started off talking about the importance of recognition, and then in later publications added redistribution, and then recognized that representation was also important, and that we had to think about the economic, the cultural, and the political all together. So I think that those things are important. So understanding who people are, where they are, so hence identities for me. And all of those things raise issues of epistemology, because it's not enough just to have research. Jonathan said just now that thinking about these issues had made him into a sort of almost Marxist or nascent Marxist, whatever, however he put it. You know, the way in which one understands the world leads to interpretation of research and so on. So epistemology is key, the way we think about knowledge, the way we think about what it is to be human and who are the most valuable humans matters. And axiology, the values that we bring to bear on all of those, cannot be divorced from thinking about these issues at all. And I think we've seen that in both the two talks that have gone earlier. So bring all that together, and we have to recognize that children's positioning and their experiences in the everyday impact on their identities and therefore on who they can be. And clearly child poverty has been much illuminated by COVID-19. And what I loved about Tanya's talk is that, of course, these were all things we knew already. It's been an exacerbation. It's not been something new. And it's also meant that we have to think about some issues. So one point is that schools serve to ameliorate some inequalities, but what they do also is to keep those inequalities from public view to some extent. What COVID-19 has done is to lay some things bare that we couldn't any longer ignore. Obviously, some people were not ignoring it in the first place, but more generally. So the fact that schools address nutrition for some children, which obviously goes along with the fact that some children get very little to eat from one week's end to the next. And so they're dependent on schools. But when schools were out, then it took the Food Foundation and Marcus Rashford and others to really agitate for that. And then the issue of access to learning and language opportunities, including through digital resources, and Tanya talked about that a bit, that schools provide them when homes cannot afford to do so. And it's a very limited access, but at least it's there. And then supporting social skills and emotional health. Schools are expected to do this on top of everything else, and obviously to some extent manage to do it, and better for some children than others. And Sarah Katan and her colleagues at the Institute of Fiscal Studies in a Nuffield Foundation study suggest that schools provide a protective and at least partly equalizing environment. But as I've said already, children are always intersectionally located. So poverty, gender, racialization, place all matter. And we know, we've always known that by the end of primary school, children from low-income families have lagged behind already, not just by the end of primary school, actually. It's happened by the end of nursery as well, that gaps have emerged. Leon Feinstein, years ago, provided a really interesting graph which showed how gaps widen long before the end of primary school. So we know that sort of by the end of primary school, it's 9 months roughly on average that children from low-income families have fallen behind, but that gap grows by the end of secondary school to 18 months. So schools act as amplifiers of disadvantage. The Nuffield Foundation obviously funds a lot of research in this area, and thinks about the ways in which it's possible to ameliorate those distinctions. But it's also the case that thinking about schools and poverty raises issues about how society views children's well-being and children's well-becoming, both. So although the sociology of childhood has really made us think that it matters what happens to children now in the here and now, I wouldn't want to lose sight of how important the well-becoming is as well. And parents were differentiated in lockdowns by how much they could help with homework, schoolwork rather, or homework, because they had to manage their own working at home or manage their shifts going out to work while their children were always at home. And also they had to manage the fact that some of them did not know that much about the school curricula and had histories of failures at school themselves, which are very difficult for some parents, and they're much more likely to be parents in poverty. And then schools, we know from the research done, schools in deprived areas gave much less support for learning at home than those in affluent areas, and took longer to get going, partly because sometimes children did not have the wherewithal to have lessons online and so on, not for a long time. It took a long time until various organizations, not just schools, but various organizations began giving out tablets and laptops and so on. And often it was one per family, and often without the support to help anybody who'd never had that set them up, and often without being able to do anything about the fact that there was no internet access in the home, or it couldn't be afforded through the phone. The NFER did a survey at that point last year when there was lockdown, and they found that teachers in the most deprived schools expected that their pupils lost 4 months by last summer, compared with only 15% of teachers expecting that in the least deprived schools. Not a surprise. So as Tanya kept saying, that these gaps are not new, they were exacerbated, not acerbated. And I think that this ties up with the issue of social recognition, because children living in poverty are not given equal social recognition, and that matters, as do all the other things that they lack because of living in poverty. And those of you who are philosophers will already know the Nancy Fraser work, but also obviously Taylor. And I like this quote from Charles Taylor, that the thesis is that our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others. And so a person or group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Due recognition is not just a courtesy we owe people, it's a vital human need. And all of this means that identities are political, and that they're an important basis for social action, and that recognition is central to that for children. And I want to give some examples now. This one doesn't come from research at all, but I've always been impressed with it. It was a 2011 television program. I've been impressed with it because we often would not be allowed to do research of this kind, where a camera person gets into little girls' bedrooms with them, 8-year-olds' bedrooms with them, and just listens to them talk and have them hang out. It's much harder for researchers to do that for long periods. And I think this exchange is really important for what I want to say. So Courtney here, Holly's family, these are both children living in poverty, in great poverty in Britain. Holly's family can afford nicer clothes than me because her family work and my family don't. For like, if something breaks down in our house, her dad can fix it and mine can't, because he can't afford the money to get the council to fix stuff and that. If your family work, you get more money in your house. But if they don't, you get less money in your house. And my mum can't lend me the money when I become 21 or whatever, or however older I become. And then, so I just want to work and do whatever I want to do. So Holly says, you never know, when you get older, you might be a richer, you never know. Courtney says, I think that my future is going to have more of the bad things in it than a few good things. Because she's going to be richer when she grows up and I'll be poor. I'm just saying, and Holly interrupts, social workers might pay for you or something. Courtney, they won't. Social workers will be dead by the time I'm 21. None of my family are working. And then this is a suppose. So she's imagining. I'm a little kid about 3, 4. I'll just ignore my future and wait for my future until it comes up and that. And I think that this is really powerful because it shows how much she already knows about what she needs for a successful future. And that by 8, she knows that even though her friend is also living in what we would call poverty, that there are huge distinctions between them and her chances are not good. And they're not good because her parents don't have employment and don't have money. To switch to the United States, and an example of a similar sort of program done in 2013 on America's poor kids. And here, Kaylee and Tyler are brother and sister, and Kaylee's 10, Tyler's 12. Their mother has lost their job in a factory and they've had to move around a great deal. And particularly when the grandmother was no longer able to help them with the rent, and then they had to move in with her and so on. But things were not satisfactory. And what it resulted in was that Kaylee was no longer in school. There wasn't a school at 10 that she could be registered in nearby where she'd moved to. And she says, I really want to be in school. If you don't get a good education, then you don't get much money. You don't get a good job. You end up sleeping at your mum's. You end up being behind a lot of rent and you get kicked out. You end up being homeless and then with no food. And I think, again, she understands entirely. She's seen what's happened with her mom. These things are real to her. And Tyler, just this one thing, Kaylee said they don't get 3 meals a day. And when I feel hungry, I feel sad and droopy. And Tyler says, sometimes when we have cereal, we don't have milk, we have to eat it dry. Sometimes when we don't have cereal and we have milk, sometimes when there's a cooking show on, I get a little more hungry. I want to vanish into the screen and start eating the food. Okay. But the other thing I want to point out is that these children do things to contribute to the household economy. Tyler mows people's lawns and he can give that to his mum. Kaylee collects cans along the railway track, and she's very, very careful not to ask for too much. She knows that at the Salvation Army shop, she is allowed to have shirts that cost 60 cents, but if it's $2, it's too much. And the point being that these children are learning subjectification in Judith Butler's, in Foucault's, in Frantz Fanon's terms. They're learning to be subjectified to their structural positioning. And as Bronwyn Davis and Sue Saltmarsh point out, they're also being foreclosed from future possibilities through their experiences. I won't read all these examples at all, but here, again, this is an Australian example from Scatterbowl and colleagues. And this young woman, 15 years old, says, my mum struggles. She gets paid on Thursdays, but struggles on the Wednesday. Me and my brother, if there's food for school, if there is no food for school, we don't go to school at all. She has never sent us to school with no food. And that's a source of pride, that they're not sent to school without any food. My mum doesn't like having my friend over when there isn't much food. She gets ashamed. Like that's the friend, is going to go tell her mum in case she says, we didn't have much for dinner tonight. Okay. And here a study that I did with Janet Boddy and Catherine Walker, Uma Venom, and so on in India and Britain. And this is a British child. No, because my mum hasn't got a car. So if mum did have a car, I would ask if I can go to after school clubs, but I can't because mum hasn't got a car and the buses don't. So this is a rural child. So the buses are really rare. They're few and far between. And so not only is this child limited in terms of what they can do after school, but they can't do after school activities either. So, and again, just as in the US example I showed you just now, this child says, on holiday, I paid for our whole lunch, our whole meal once. And on another holiday, I paid for our drinks. And Catherine asks, oh, okay, that's money you've been saving up yourself? Yeah. And oh, and the meal I argued to actually pay for. So I'm also going to pay for my mum's food when we go to the restaurant for her birthday. And Catherine says, oh, that's nice. So where do you get the money from that you're saving up? Because you were saying before as well about saving up for an Xbox. I get it from pocket money. I get £2 a week from my grandma. Okay. And I think that it's really crucial to think about the ways in which children's identities are relationally as well as intersectionally formed from their positioning in relation to poverty. Their current well-being and their future possibilities are limited by their positioning, and they know it if they're living in poverty. They're not blank slates by any means. And quite frequently children are not spoken to themselves. So they not only learn how they're positioned, but also that they're not considered worthy of resources. Jonathan Douglas from the National Literacy Trust, talking about exactly what Tanya started off talking about, the fact that the government has agreed to put in 1.4 million to make up children's learning, the deficit, as some people see it. But as Tanya points out, the deficit already existed. And Jonathan Douglas says, we know from emerging evidence in our own work across schools and communities that children have fallen behind in their learning over the past year, especially those in the most disadvantaged communities. Everybody recognizes that, but it's just not enough. And we know, for example, that what Britain has offered is something like £341 per child to make up what they see as a deficit in learning. In the United States, which we don't usually think of as so generous, they've agreed to pay at least over £1,000 equivalent per child. And in the Netherlands, more than £2,000 equivalent per child. And these are not necessarily the most generous settlements that are being made to try to redress what happened with children's learning. So Britain is just not very generous to children, doesn't think that it's so important. And yet we know that over the period of lockdown, some children really did not miss a beat in terms of their education and schooling, those who are more affluent. And from this week's THE, Beverly Daniel Tatum says, Black students have often learned people don't expect much from them. Her long career as a psychologist and a college president has shown how crucial racial identity formation is and how overriding negative stereotypes about minority students' performance can be like water in a parched land. I think this is equally true of if we could override negative stereotypes about children living in poverty who are not valued. So an intersectional perspective is crucially important, but so are these negative stereotypes. And this brings me on to, in the summer, once Marcus Rashford and the Food Foundation and other people had campaigned successfully for children to be given food in the holidays, then one of the companies who was paid very well, a private company, to deliver meals to children, gave this family, this that's in the picture, for 10 days food for one child. And how could anybody actually pack this up for 10 days food for a child? And I just have here Stephen Ball, a paper of his from 2015, Living the Neoliberal University. And he says, I was a child of beverage, of the British post-war welfare state, of free milk and orange juice, of NHS dentistry. I'm now a neoliberal academic working for a global HE brand, ranked in international comparison sites for performance-related pay. And I think that this is really important. Things have changed for the worse, actually. And I always like this quote from Liz Heron's edited collection, Truth, Dare or Promise, Girls Growing Up in the 50s, where I think it shows how recognition, redistribution and representation really open possibilities for children's identities as well as other things. And in the introduction, Liz Heron says, along with the orange juice and the cod liver oil, the malt supplement and the free school milk, we may also have absorbed a certain sense of our own worth and the sense of a future that would get better and better, as if history were on our side. And that was 1985. So it's not thinking about the things that have happened to children since. So I want to finish off by thinking about the unequal distribution of hope. And this is from Hassan Haj, who's an Australian sociologist. And he says, one of the areas I would like to subject most to self-critique is the very idea of the unequal distribution of hope, which has been the trope that has taken up most from my work. Centering on a question of distribution can blind us as to the process of production. In other words, it's not innocent. It's not just that this happens to people, it's produced. Indeed, you know, he says it's also about how to it makes us forget about exploitation. That is, framing a differential of hope solely in terms of a distributional problematic actively works to stop us from seeing the process of extraction and exploitation in which the inequality is grounded, so that, you know, people are not treated equally. And in the same piece of work, he says, generally, the problematic of exploitation invites us to think that a solution to the inequality of hope cannot reside in a politics of redistribution. Rather, one has to think about modes of imagining one's own hope with the hope of others and not at their expense. That is, it is an invitation for a politics of co-hoping. Co-hoping with the other is crucial today, whether it's conceived from an interhuman perspective or whether it's conceived from an interspeciesist perspective. And that's it.